Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to show you my first impressions of the games I've played that premiered at this year's Essen Spiel 2019, which is a German game convention that took place maybe about 10 days ago. I did a preview video where I talked about some of the games I was anticipating, which was pretty much shooting in the dark, just based on what I could find online about those games. And since then, I've been able to play a lot of the games that have premiered at the fair. So I figured I'd come back and tell you about the games I've gotten to the table and what I think about them so far. Again, all of these are going to be first impressions, not really, a review, but it should give you some sense of, what I think about the games in question. I certainly do also have a lot of games that I still have yet to play that I didn't get to the table yet, including some that I'm really anticipating. I'm going to be going to Board Game Geek Con in about another 10 days, so I'll play some before that, and I'll definitely play a lot more at that convention. Indeed, if you're going to that convention and you want to, if you see me, say hi, or if you want to shoot me an email on Board Game Geek, we could maybe play a game together. But I will have a lot of game playing now in the next 2 or 3 weeks, so I'll probably do a follow-up video to this after Board Game Geek Con, which is in about, like I said, 10-15 days. So let me show you some games. So I made actually a list, and I've got a lot of games sitting around me, and I guess there's nowhere to begin except for the beginning. So if you'll just pardon me while I grab some of these games. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, or else I'm worried I'd miss something. But the first game that I'll talk about is Six Castles, and this is put out by Pythagoras Games, and it is a tile-laying game for 2 to 4 players. It plays about 45 minutes. It's designed by Rolla and Costa. Those are our design team. They worked on a couple games, most recently Yinzi, which is a Spielworks game, a heavy game that came out earlier this year. This is decidedly lighter than that, but by the standards of the tile-laying genre, I would say it's relatively complicated. Indeed, my first play of this was a little bit tortured. The rulebook, there is an English rulebook included in the game, but it was somewhat inscrutable, and I kind of we had to learn as we played the very first play. So I'm looking to getting this back to the table with a little bit more insight in how you play going into it. Usually I don't try to learn from the rule book, but when I read the rule book, it just wasn't making sense, and we just decided to dive in. And as a result, I didn't have the best first impression of the game, but I do think it's interesting. By the end of it, I liked it a lot more. So what you're going to be doing is essentially you're going to have a collective Carcassonne style tile laying area where you're all going to be contributing tiles with various illustrations on them, and each player is going to put a contribution to that tile, and then you're going to be able to score based on adjacencies to the tile that you've just laid down. And there's 2 ways of scoring. You either put a meeple out onto that space, or you can advance along a track. You'll have a track in front of you with various icons, and you could, if you place next to those icons, you can move along that track, and eventually you'll have either meeples out on the board with one set of icons, and you can claim those meeples to score on a communal board that shows all the various icons, or you can claim for the progress that you've made along your track. If you've passed, for example, 4 trees on the track, you might be able to put a disc onto a communal scoring board, and only one person is going to be able to score each of those various symbols. So you're competing against each other for something like 10, 12 different symbols. So it's very much a lot going on at once. And then there's this other aspect of the game where you could sell goods to various castles that get formed over the game. It felt a little restrictive in how you could lay your tiles, because if you have one that could form a castle, you have to play it if you can, which kind of forces your hand sometimes. But overall, like I said, it's more of a gamer's tile-laying game than something like Carcassonne, a little bit more complex than usual for the genre, something I'm looking forward to playing more once I was able to get the rules down by the end of that first play. So that is Six Castles. The next one I'm going to talk about is actually called Barrage, and I have that somewhere here. It's actually right here. This is my copy. I've actually never played my personal copy of this, but I've played it now about 5 times. I kickstarted this, and So it's been out in the States a little while, but I know that it was an Essen premiere. And this is one of the, it's a very, literally, and in terms of complexity, a very heavy game. And it's themed around hydroelectricity. You're going to be building networks of power plants and dams and trying to run your energy most efficiently. Game already came out with an expansion when it launched, and I've played with and without the expansion. And it's even without the expansion, it's one that's pretty thinky. But it's one that I really enjoy. Like I said, I've probably played it now 5 or 6 times, and I'm really happy with it. One of the better heavy games of this year. Definitely one that people should get to the table, I would say. It's definitely been covered elsewhere because it came out in that Kickstarter, so I won't go into depth on that. The next one, right here in front of me, this is Bloomtown. So this, I think, is being sold in the States. It came out at Essen overseas in England, or in Europe rather, and it's being sold, I think, exclusively at Walmarts in the United States. So if you want a copy of that, I think it's a timed exclusive for them. And this is a tile laying game along the lines of something like 5x5 City or Quadropolis, except that it's a little bit simpler, which might be not surprising for something that is sold as a Walmart exclusive. Essentially, each turn you're going to have a couple tiles in your hand. You're going to pick one to play, score it based upon how many like tiles are either connected to it in some manner or how many different tiles are connected to it. So very basic, tile laying game. And then based on this plot where you lay it on, it'll have a symbol on it. It'll determine what your next tile is. So the big decision in the game is really that you're either going to place that tile that you have maximally, or maybe you might want to place it in a subpar manner to get a better tile into your hand. So it's relatively light. I have to say that, based on this, Quadropolis and 5x5 City, which are all very similar tile laying games, this would be a distant third behind those other games. I do actually really like Quadropolis, and 5x5 City has more variety in the box than this one does. This one also has somewhat randomized scorings that just pop up and catch you off guard that I don't particularly like. So I'm not sure how long this is going to stick around in my collection, and that is Bloomtown. The next game that I wanted to talk about is, and I believe this one's already available at retail in the States, it's Carnival of Monsters. This is put out by Amigo. It's designed by Richard Garfield. It's a drafting game, and it's relatively straightforward. First of all, it's a very big box for a drafting card game, but it's well produced. But really, this is a deck of cards with some coins. It doesn't really need to be in a box this size. And I only got to play this once so far, and I played it with 3 players, which wasn't really ideal because only, I think you get 8 or 9 cards per round, so only like 24 to 27 cards were going around the table each round, which is a problem because the game essentially has 5 suits, and you're trying to collect things in like suits, so if there's only 25 cards at the table, it's very possible that there won't be you're capturing monsters on the cards. It's possible there won't be a monster of a given type. So that, I think, the game does play 2 5-players. So I think you definitely want to play this with 4 or 5 players. I'd probably reserve judgment until I get to play with 4 or 5. I liked what I saw. It's just that a 3-player experience, and it does actually say it plays at 2, which seems crazy. But a 3-player experience was a little bit frustrating because I knew that I was building an engine to build, let's say, undersea creatures, and then very few undersea creatures got out just because over the course of the game there were only a quarter, if that, of the deck even being exposed. So that, like many drafting games, you probably want to play this with more players. But I'll withhold judgment on that until I get to play it some more. Moving on, I have this game, which was also a Kickstarter to me, but I believe they were selling this at Essen. This is Circadian's First Light, and I think I've played this now 3 or 4 times. This is a relatively medium to medium heavy dice drafting game where, actually it's a dice programming game where you're going to roll your dice behind your screen, place them as workers to determine actions, then simultaneously reveal them, and one at a time go around the table taking actions to either collect resources, turn those resources into victory points, or use them to build cards that are going to give you special powers. I have to say the art is uncommonly bad in this, but the game is actually quite good. I've enjoyed my plays of it, just trying to figure out which cards I want to use to build my little engine, and that is a pretty enjoyable thing. One of the cool things about the game is it's a dice placement game, but if you use your dice to score or to build one of those cards I was just talking about, it will go out of circulation. It's essentially locked away for the rest of the game, so you have to keep doing actions that cost resources that boost your dice pool back up. So managing that is a nice, interesting wrinkle. It does feel maybe a round or so too long. The game kind of has a weird arc where early on in the game you're going to get very few resources at the start, and then after maybe by round 3 or 4 you're going to have a ton of resources, be able to build tons of cards and cash in tons of resources for points, and then by the last round, because of the way the dice get locked, there'll be very few spaces available for you to do actions that are going to score you significant numbers of points. You won't be able to build cards perhaps anymore. That's happened several times in the games I've played where nobody could build a card at the end of the game because all the spaces that let you build cards were taken. So that's a little weird. It feels almost like there need to be more options. The other thing is you get a little Land Rover that you can move around on a map, and often, by mid-game you'll have maximized your utility of that. So despite that, I have enjoyed my plays. It does feel like you peak, and then the last round or so is really just cleanup. So those are my thoughts on that. Next up, we have Coralia. This is a decidedly lighter game. This is also a dice drafting and dice placement game. This is but definitely a family game. The box says it plays in about 30 minutes and it says ages 10 and up. You probably could even play with younger people than that. The art is gorgeous in this. The gameplay is relatively straightforward. It's really not super complicated, and I'm not sure how long this is going to hold my interest. Essentially, each turn, you're going to be able to... You'll have 3 dice passed to you from the player before you. You'll get to pick a new die out, they're going to be different colors. Roll it, and then pick 1 die from the 4 dice to place onto a communal board with essentially dice placement spaces, which are going to get increasingly occupied over the course of the game. So there's elements of set collection. There's essentially area control in the game where you could put an octopus on the board and mark it as your territory, and you'll score for however many occupied spaces are in that area at the end of the game. There's essentially not that much interaction. It's essentially you're going to go roll the dice, pick a die, place it somewhere, get a few points. There's cards that you're trying to collect different fish on, and there's a majority scoring for collecting pearls. But really it's just a real point salad game, which is kind of interesting because all of those different things have a lot of niggly rules, but still a family weight game. So it's a game that almost takes 15-20 minutes to explain, and then it only takes maybe 20 or 30 minutes to play. So it's a very light game, but a kind of rules heavy one. So it's a kind of odd duck, I think. But I didn't dislike it. It's just I'm not sure that I would opt for this one over some other light dice placement games that I have, such as Vienna or maybe Kingsburg if I wanted something a little bit longer. So that is Coralia. Next up, we have another nautical-themed game, and I think that was one of the big trends at this year's Essen. There's another game that I haven't gotten to the table yet about deep-sea drilling. I think that's called, I actually forget the title, but it's from the designer of Escape, I believe. But this is entirely different. This is called Deep Blue. This is the new Days of Wonder game. This one is really a family game, and it plays in about an hour. But this definitely has more strategy in it than Coralia does. This one is essentially it's a deck building game where you're going to be grabbing cards that either let you move your ship around on the board or that allow you to play your cards when people go on a diving expedition. So essentially, if your ship is present when there's a dive going on, every time there's a bag full of gems are going to get pulled out of the bag one at a time, and if you have a card that scores that type of gem, you could play that and score those gems. So you want to generally go into the dive with as many cards in your hand as possible, but refreshing your hand is costly. So the tension between buying cards, keeping your cards in your hand and not playing them, and then also being the person to initiate the dive for bonus does give you a lot of strategic decisions in what's kind of a push your luck game, but actually has really impressed me more than I thought it would. When I first read that it was about pulling cubes out of a bag, essentially, I was a little bit trepidatious, but I had a very positive impression of it. It's a well-designed, beautifully done, very well-developed family game that does have some interesting decisions in it. So, Deep Blue, so far, so good on that one. The next one that I wanted to talk about is up here. It is a two-player only card game by the name of Magdala. This is put out by Lookout Games, and it's designed by Trevor Benjamin and Brett Gilbert. And the box says it takes 20 minutes. I've played this certainly in 10 minutes, and we've played round after round of this. And this is one of those games that if you have a partner that you play with over and over, the same sorts of card games, like the sort of person you might play Lost Cities or something with, this is really going to be ideal. This is one of my favorite games so far at this year's Essen Hall, so to speak. And the way that works is there are essentially just going to be 6 different colored cards, and there are 2 play fields. The game actually comes with this really nice cloth mat. I could show you that. So, oops. It comes with this cloth mat, which you'll spread out on the table, and there's 2 play areas there, and each of those play areas could essentially hold each color of card only on one side of its circle. So there's a circle where you can play cards too in the middle, and then you each have an area on your own side of that circle. And every color can only be present there once. Once the colors are all present there, once a 6th color gets added to it, then it's going to score, and you take turns taking stacks of one color and putting it into your scoring area. And there's a kind of like almost a stock market aspect of the game where you're going to be trying to delay taking a color, because the longer you wait to take a given color, the more points it will be worth. But all of this makes it sound a little bit more complicated than it is, because this is truly a game that you could play in 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then you'll want to just play it again. At least that's been my experience. It's really a terrific game. I believe it's coming out in the U.S., or should be out in the U.S. relatively soon, so I would highly recommend that you look at Magdala. Let me just pick up this card that I dropped, and we'll move on. Alright, the next game is an entirely different beast, and it's actually down here, and that is Maracaibo. And this is a heavy game designed by Alexander Pfister of Great Western Trail, Blackout Hong Kong, Mombasa fame, and this is definitely, I feel like this one might be a little bit controversial. It's a pirate-themed game where you're going to be moving around, basically doing laps around the Caribbean, and it has a relatively decent theming, and indeed there's a story aspect in it where you could play game after game, adding different elements in. But essentially, like, it has almost a structure similar to Great Western Trail, where you're going to be doing a circuitous route over and over the course of the game. But there's an element here where if one person gets to the end of the track that you do, it forces all the other players to go to the end of the track, which does introduce what is probably the most significant form of interaction that the game has, because generally it's not super interactive. But it does, seem like it has the potential to be frustrating. It allows somebody to just, really push the game to a quick conclusion. And I'm not sure how much control you would have over that if somebody wanted to do that. That being said, the game, I've played it now twice, and I think that, to me, it gives you so many options that it almost feels like you don't have any angst, because you could always do something that's going to be pretty good on your turn. Everything's, like many point salad games, you're going to always feel that you have decent options, maybe not the best option, but you could do something that's going to further your cause. And because of that, it doesn't have a lot of tension. Even though the game does rely heavily on cards, much like Great Western Trail does, or much like Blackout Hong Kong does, there's not a lot of tension in how you're playing those cards. You're often cycling through your entire hand of cards in a turn. just trying to either dig through the deck to find a card that's going to synergize with what you have in front of you. It's more of a tableau building game than I would say either of those other two games are. So it has a different feel. It almost feels more like a Terraforming Mars in some respects because of the way that you're trying to synergize cards together than it feels like a real hand management game like Great Western Trail does. So there's not really a deck building aspect of it, so don't really go into it expecting that. Expect it to be more of a tableau builder. And I will say that I played it, the two games I played, it has a variable setup both through the campaign and through variable standard stock scenarios that aren't tied to the larger campaign. And different tiles came out in each of those games on the board and changed the way that different board spaces interacted. And those two games I played did feel significantly different, enough that I want to continue to explore it. I will say that the people that I've played it with have really commented on how heavy it seems, whereas I'm the person who taught it, and I'm the person who actually sat and read the rules. To me, it did not seem particularly overbearing. You only really have three major options on your turn, and it's largely going to be dictated by the space where you go. So there's a lot of things that you could do, but ultimately your turns are going to be pretty simple. And I think that future playtimes will bring, once everybody at the table has played before, the playtime will go down. So I'm not really worried about that. But what I am worried about is what seems like to be a relative lack of tension compared to Pfister's other heavy games. So we'll see if that bears out over future plays, but I am looking forward to playing it, but it's not knocking my socks off exactly yet. So that's what I think about Maracaibo. So I realized that I broke my alphabetical order that I was working on here, and I neglected to talk about Babylonia. This is a Reiner Knizia game. It's a tile laying game that is very much similar to other Knizia tile laying games. So even though the map of the game is set along the Tigris and the Euphrates, it's not really as much like Tigris and Euphrates as maybe his games Through the Desert and Samurai. It's almost like a melding of those two games, although it would also warrant comparisons to his recent family game Blue Lagoon. So if you've played those games, you might have a sense of how this one works, but essentially each turn you're going to be playing 2 or 3 tiles out onto the board with the hopes of surrounding scoring areas and also extending a network of connected tiles of your own. So there's going to be various spaces on the board, some that are kind of first come, first serve. If you're the first person to get in there, you get some small number of points. Others that will score, but then score for an entire chain of your light-colored pieces. And really trying to balance those low-hanging fruit scorings versus the longer-term network scorings is really where the game gets its depth. There's also some special powers that you could get if you get majorities around these ziggurats, which are placed on the board at the start of the game. Definitely one that I'm interested in playing more. It seems like you could play in a lot of different directions. The game that I've played of it, I've only played it once. Different people went in different, strategic directions. Some people were working more towards the instant scorings, and other people were working towards the longer-term scorings. And the scores, considering the game scored, over like 150, 160 points, were relatively close. So that's promising. So I'm looking forward to playing that. And also, it does feel like a game where strategy is going to develop a little bit with repeated plays, like most Knizia games. So that is Babylonia. So moving back down to my alphabetical list, I have, let me just actually get these out of the way before I have a tower collapse. So the next game I wanted to talk about is up here. This is the Masters of the Renaissance. It's the Lorenzo Il Magnifico card game. And this is, the box says 60 minutes. There's no way on earth this game is going to take you 60 minutes to play, unless you have very slow players. It's really more of a 30 to 45 minute game. And it really distills the Lorenzo Il Magnifico, which is a dice drafting game, down to it's almost like thematic essentials. It almost bears no particular resemblance to Lorenzo, except that you're kind of collecting cards that you could run as an engine. That's really about it. Otherwise, the way that you collect resources, the way that you manage your resources, the way that you take your actions, it's all different. I do like the game, I have to say, but I was surprised at how comparatively light it was. There wasn't a lot of angst in my decisions. There's a little bit of angst about, the way that you collect resources. If you collect too many, it benefits all the other players at the table. But ultimately, you're only building up to, I think, 7 different cards over the course of the game. So generally, you're going to, take some resources, build a card, use that card to get more resources, build a card. So it's kind of like lather, rinse, repeat, which is fine for a 35, 40 minute game or so. But it definitely is not something that I feel like I'm going to be returning to as much as the original Lorenzo Magnifico, which is one of my preferred Euro games over the last few years. This is a little bit simpler, and I'm somebody who generally likes simple games, but this one, it's not, easy. It's more complex than something like, say, Splendor. Don't get me wrong, but I just feel like it's sitting in an uneasy spot where it's not going to satisfy you the way that a fully strategic game is, and it's a little bit more complex than something that you could classify as a filler. So we'll see what sort of longevity this has, but those are my first impressions on that. So moving on, this is probably, if you'll give me a moment, Miyabi. This is designed by Michael Kiesling. This might be my favorite game so far at this year's Essen. This is even though he did have a follow-up to Azul, the Promenade, the Summer Promenade, this one feels very much like it's cut from the same cloth. Even though it looks like, if you would look at the components, it looks like another game of his by the name of Sansushi. It's really more of a Azul type game, where each player is going to have a player board in front of them, which has a grid on it where you're going to be placing tiles which you draft from a communal pool. So the game has an interesting dynamic in it where you want to essentially stack those tiles that you're taking over the course of the game up higher, because if they're on multiple levels, they're going to score a multiplier. So something with 3 bushes on it on the 4th level will score 3 times 4, 12 points. So you want to do that, but by covering up the other symbols to place the tile higher up, you're giving up points for the majority scoring at the end of the game, because at the end of the game, each row of symbols, you're going to be scoring who has the most of those still showing on the top, when you look down on the player board. So you're really bouncing those two, that endgame scoring versus the in-game scoring, in an interesting way. It also has a cool puzzle dynamic where when you draft a tile, it'll have a symbol on it. In each of your rows of your player board has a corresponding symbol, so it can only be placed in that row. And then the column that you're placing it in, you can only use each column once per turn. So you're really trying to, consider where you're going to be taking your future tiles, hoping that you're going to be able to take all 6 of your tiles over the course of the round. So it's a really satisfying and gratifying puzzle game. It's one that I actually haven't won yet, even though I've probably played it 5 or 6 times. I'm just always obsessed with building up high, and I do miserably at the end of the game for the majority scoring points. But it's one that I really enjoy. I'm happy I've got this. I'm sure I'll enjoy the new Azul when I finally get around to playing that. But this one is absolutely terrific. It's a little bit under the radar in comparison, but it's definitely worth checking out. That is Miyabi. Alright, the next game that I'll talk about is another, I would say medium weight Euro by the name of the Magnificent. This is from the designers of Santa Maria, and it's ostensibly circus themed, although one of my complaints about it is that the theme is barely there at all. And I'm not a deeply thematic gamer, but here it's just felt like mechanics based up, layered on mechanics, and that, I think to a certain point detracts it, because you're using all this terminology that has to do with themes, but it doesn't really have to do with what you're actually doing in the game. So it's a little bit disconnected in that regard. That being said, I do like the game. It was, I would say, less complex than I expected it to be going in. There's only really 3 actions that you could do on your turn. You could either move around this little caravan track, which is shared among players to collect some materials. You could draft a die to take some Tetris pieces and put them on your player board, potentially earning bonuses, or you could use a do a performance, which essentially looks at those Tetris pieces that are on your board versus some cards that you've collected and gives you points for that. So really you're just alternating between those three different things and trying to maximize your score as you're doing it. It's a in and of itself, it's definitely an interesting exercise, and I enjoyed it, and I'm happy to play it again. But I think people are gonna expect a circus-themed game, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the circus. So that's just a word of warning. If you care, if it bothered me how Little Theme was in there, I think most people would be really turned off by how Little Theme is in here. But if you do like manipulating Tetris pieces and maximizing resources and managing money to pay for the dice that you're drafting over the course of the game, you'll probably like that. But just be aware, it's really just a collection of pretty random Euro mechanisms. So that is the Magnificent. And moving on, let's see, where am I at? The next one, I actually forgot to drag it over here. It's called No Return. It has a German subtitle, and I'll just throw up a picture of it. But it is essentially a game that it's just a bag of tiles, and it almost works like a reverse or a kind of like sister to Lost Cities. Essentially, you're going to have 8 tiles in front of you each turn, and you can either, in the first half of the game, you can play a set of those 8 tiles down in front of you if they're the same color, but they have to start high and work low. So like you could play a 10, 9, 6, but then you'll never be able to go back and play a 7 in there. Or you could play, you can only play another 6 or lower. And you'll have various rows in each of the colors. I think there's 6 colors in the game. And then at a certain point, as the bag starts to dwindle, you have to make the determination to start using the tiles that you're drawing to pay essentially for the tiles that you have down in front of you. And so in the second half of the game, you could only use a set of tiles of this one color to pay for a set of tiles that sum up to the same thing or lower. So for example, if I had a 6 and a 4 in white, I could get rid of a blue 9 and 1 if I had those laying in front of me. Any tiles that you're able to pay for in that manner are going to become positive points. Any that are left at the end of the game, which is when the bag runs out, are going to be negative points. So you want to make sure that you want to spend as much time as possible getting tiles down in front of you, but you want to start cashing them in before you get stuck with negative points. So it's really just the whole game hinges on that one decision point. And watching other players and seeing when they're going to go and make that jump into the second half of the game and maybe taking one extra turn yourself is kind of interesting. And for like a 20-minute filler game, it's really enjoyable. I think it's only available now in Germany, but I was able to actually import it without any problems off of Amazon, so I would encourage you to check that one out. That's a cool game. The next one that I have here is another Kickstarter. This is Paladins of the West Kingdom. This is designed by Shem Phillips, put out by Garphill Games. I think it's maybe the 8th. Is it the 8th or the 5th? It's maybe the 5th or 8th of these games. I've lost count. I think it's the second game in the second trilogy, so that would be the 5th game of the Paladins of the West Kingdom is the title of it. It is essentially a game where it almost reminds me a little bit of Orleans, where you're going to have a player board in front of you that you're going to be able to use meeples to execute actions each turn. The interesting thing is that each turn you're going to essentially draft those meeples, and so you kind of have to do all of your planning for a given round up front based on the colors that you're taking. And then I run into a little bit of trouble with the game because essentially once you get your meeples, for the most part, it's not going to be especially interactive. There are very few, starting in the 3rd round, there's going to be some action spaces that you're going to be able to take using your meeples, which are public spaces. But generally you're going to be focused on your own little player board and really just executing the plan that you came up with at the start of the round. There's a few like interactive elements like who drafts this card first or whatever, but generally it does feel a little bit like multiplayer solitaire to the degree that it's not as enjoyable as I might have expected. So I've played it now I think 4 times, and I've kind of liked it a little bit less with each play, and now I think I've standardized my opinion of it. It's fine, and I'm okay with it, but I find the core mechanic of it less interesting than I do in Architects of the West Kingdom, which has that arresting people mechanic, which is definitely more interactive, and I probably like it less than Raiders of the North Sea as well, which has that cool worker, place a worker, take a worker mechanism where you have to kind of plan and chain your routes several turns in advance, but that's more interactive because you're all placing and taking workers from a collective pool. This is definitely a little heavier, so it rewards your strategic planning, but it's definitely more of a strategic planning game, less a player interaction game. So that is Paladins of the West Kingdom. Next game that I wanted to talk about is Parks, and this is I don't know if this was a Kickstarter or not, but I just got it at retail in the US. I knew it, but its European premiere was at Essen, and this is essentially a game which has absolutely stunning artworks. The cards, I think, are entirely different than each other, and they are illustrations of different national parks. Probably one of the most beautiful games I've ever seen, but it's really just a recipe collection, resource collection, recipe completion game, where you're going to have two little guys walking along a track. They can only move forward, can't move back, and generally you can't go into occupied spaces. So it's about dealing with those constraints and trying to maximize your points, complete as many recipes or park visits as you can within those constraints. I found the game to be a little bit stultifying, a little bit simple. Not one I'm going to keep, but it's absolutely beautiful. I wish I liked the game more than I did because the components are gorgeous. It's so well produced, but I just don't especially enjoy the gameplay of it. So that is Parks. Next one to talk about is Pharaoh, Pharaoh, which is French for Pharaoh. So pardon my French. This is basically a worker placement, it's kind of a worker placement game, but your workers are going to be your resources. So the game has this cool, and I'll put up a picture of it, this cool circular board where each player is going to be, each round you're going to rotate this cost chart that goes in the center of the sections of the board. And each different section of the board is going to let you do things, whether it's collect cards, which give you powers, or move along a victory point track, or exchange one type of resource for another resource. And essentially you have this tight number of resources, and like I said, there's two main kinds of actions. One that essentially turn your resources into other resources or get you more resources. The others that let you spend those resources for points. And trying to balance those two actions is really where the game has all of its strategy. I think that it's definitely more of a 60-minute type of game, so definitely more of a medium weight game, and it's one that I've enjoyed my plays of. The only drawback that I see for the game is that there's essentially at the start of the game, based on the modular board setup, you're gonna have gods on different spokes of the wheel essentially, and each one of those is going to want you to do some of the actions that they're by. So if you want to score those gods, which you definitely want to do by the end of the game, you're going to have to dabble in everything. And I feel like, to a certain extent, every player is going to be dabbling in everything. And it's generally pretty obvious when you want to do certain actions because the cost of them are going to go down in certain rounds. So to that degree, I think that the game might not have the longevity that I would hope, but so far I've really enjoyed my plays of it. We'll see if it continues to be enjoyable, since you don't really specialize in the game. You have to kind of be a generalist as far as I can tell. The next game is right here, and this one is an extremely limited print run, so I'm not sure how widely available this was at Essen. My copy of it actually says 54 out of 200. I read on Board Game Geek that it was being sold at Essen, and I know that it had a Kickstarter beyond that, so who knows where 54 out of 200 comes from. But this game is called Promenade. It's put out by the Taiwan Board Game Group, and this is a super cool game. It is essentially a deck building game with an economic game tacked into it. Essentially, there are cards in various colors. They represent paintings that you're acquiring, and as you buy those paintings, or as you exhibit them for victory points, the value of each of those paintings is going to go up. So if you have blue cards and you exhibit it, all blue cards among all players in the game are going to rise in value and could be used to buy other paintings more efficiently, or will be worth more points at the end of the game. So it has this really interesting economy where by doing something you might be helping other players out, making their deck more valuable by trying to do something to get yourself victory points. The game plays in maybe 45 minutes to an hour. It's very cleanly designed. It's almost the version that I have is kind of prototypey in nature, has a cloth board, and the cards aren't the best quality, but the game really does overcome any component issues that I have of it. I really enjoy it, and I'm really hoping that it gets a larger print run. I'm hoping that there aren't only 200 copies of this available, because it's a game that deserves to be seen and played more widely. I did look on Board Game Geek. I was thinking about doing a video of it, but there was a pretty decent run through by another YouTuber, so I would encourage you to check this game out. It's super cool. Promenade. The next one that I will talk about is right here. Actually, I'll talk here about this, which is actually an expansion map called Railways of Portugal. This is designed by Vital Lacerda. This is for Railways of the World. It's just a new 2 to 4 player expansion map. It was designed by Vital Lacerda, which made me think that it might be more complicated than it actually turned out to be. It's pretty much just a standard, relatively tight, lower player count map for Railways of the World. That's one of my preferred. That's my preferred game in the Railways of the World Steam Age of Steam trilogy. This one has a couple of small rule changes, nothing major. Essentially, there are some islands that you have to take ferry goods out to, which is a difference. And then there's some weird rules about the limitations into building into Lisbon, which is the main city on the map. But other than that, it's just pretty well designed, simple game, a simple map for the game. I kind of might prefer the Nippon map to this one for the lower player counts. That has more terrain to traverse. That's more daunting. This one's relatively easy to deal with in comparison, I felt. But I did definitely enjoy the map. There were some small promos that are tied to his other games, like a Vinhos and a Lisboa promo in the box. I didn't play with those, so maybe those would mix up the game a little more. I'm looking forward to finding out. I will also say that, as an aside, I did play the new version of Age of Steam, the deluxe version that just shipped to Kickstarter backers. Not sure if that was at Essen or not. That's really a beautiful version of that game. Personally, I find Age of Steam to be almost too tight to be enjoyable. It's definitely a challenging game, but I feel like because it's so tight, you're not really paying attention to other players. You're just, have existential dread the entire game, worrying that you're going to be spiraling into bankruptcy, so you don't even have time to worry about other players. Whereas this one, I feel like, is more interactive because, cards will come out that say, like, be the first person to deliver to town X or whatever, and you'll all of a sudden all race to that because you have more resources and the ability to take on loans, at any time, so you could be a little bit more flexible. That's probably why I prefer that series. But that's an aside. Railways of Portugal, a good map for the game. The next one that I'll talk about is this one. It's this is not generally in my wheelhouse, but it was put out by Czech Games Edition. It's by the name of Sanctum. This is I guess themed like the Diablo computer game, which is a hack and slash D&D type game, roguelike game, and it tries to simulate that in a board game form. I wouldn't say that's especially successful in terms of that, although I guess you're going to be killing guys, getting loot, getting experience, and going on that loop, which is kind of how those video games work. So it does do that, but in practice what you're going to be doing is essentially you'll have a dice pool with some abilities that let you manipulate those dice. And enemies will have numbers on them, and you have to manipulate your dice so they match the numbers that are on the enemies to kill them. So it's really about dice manipulation, trying to cleverly and most efficiently manipulate all of those dice. So that part of the game I really liked, and it was satisfying to build up the character over the course of the game. I enjoyed that. But then the game kind of ends with this climactic final battle, which just is essentially where you either live or die, and if you live, among all the players who have lived, the person with the most hit points left is the person who is going to win. So it really is the entire, first, 80%, 75% of the game is really just busy work building up your character for that final battle, which is kind of like an Arkham Horror sort of thing, I suppose, but I didn't find that to be especially satisfying in this game, which is a shame because I really was fine with the dice manipulation part of the game besides it. But it just seems sort of out of balance and weird to me. Like, for example, you generally won't take damage unless you're playing kind of carelessly or recklessly through the entire first 5 acts of the game, and then only in that final act are you really going to be put in a position where you're going to start taking damage. And that just seems bizarre to me, and I just couldn't really wrap my head around the rhythm of the game in that respect. And it sort of left a sour taste in my mouth, because I did like the game till that. Maybe it's one that you have to go into it expecting that that's how it's going to play out, but it was one that I wasn't really enamored with. So that is my take on Sanctum. The next one is over here. Actually, this one I skipped over in the alphabet. This is called Rumble Nation. This one's put out by Hobby Japan. I believe you would have to go to Amazon.jp to order this. Maybe the Board Game Geek store would get this. They get sometimes Japanese games. This is a really cool, just show you the box, 20-minute area control game, where each turn it's kind of divided into 2 phases. The first phase, though, each turn you're going to put little numbers 2 to 12 out on the various territories on the map of Japan. Each turn you're going to roll 3 dice, pair up 2 of those dice like you're playing Can't Stop or something, and then those 2 dice will determine which area you place in. The third dice is going to determine, or the third die is going to determine how many cubes you get to put into that area. And it'll just keep going with all players doing that until they've placed all of their cubes. The first player to place it gets, a number, the highest tiebreaker token, but other players get to keep taking turns with more information about where the cubes are until they've all placed all their cubes. Then the second half of the game, you're going to resolve the various territories, starting with 2, working your way up to 12. Those are going to give points for the person who wins them, but more importantly, if you win the territory outright, you'll get to put reinforcements in your adjacent territories where you still have cubes, which means that the low-value territories aren't worth a lot of points, but they could potentially get you extra cubes into the higher value territories. So trying to consider those 2 things is really interesting. So for a 20-30 minute game, super terrific, really enjoyable. I would encourage you to check this one out, Rumble Nation. Next game I'll talk about is, I've combined them into a box here, is Silver. There's also a Silver Bullet. This is essentially just a slightly more gamer-y and a mix and match version of a game that I really like, a filler game that came out a little earlier this year by the name of Cabo. And this just gives you more card options to do that. Essentially, you'll have a row of cards in front of you. You'll be able to know what some of those are, but you won't know what others are. And you want to have the lowest total of numbers at the end of the round when somebody declares it's the end of the round, assuming that they have the lowest total of cards. And it's just a very interactive, very luck-driven game, but it's one that, within those constraints, does make you feel like you're being clever, making clever plays. I really like the Cabo version of this, but these extra powers are terrific to play with as well in Silver and Silver Bullet. The next version, or next game that I'll talk about, is called Squire. It has a subtitle, The Collector of the Glorious Rarities. So that's a handful. But this is a game about art collection. Essentially, you're going to be moving around on a board, and you have relatively limited movement, although you could augment it with tickets. And then the board is divided into different colors, regions of different colors, and then you'll be collecting paintings and works of art that are going to be also in different colors. And there's a market thing that, based on the color of the region where you're taking it and the color of the painting, the price is going to fluctuate. So if a person buys, let's say, a red painting in a yellow area, those will become the most expensive region and color of painting to acquire for the next player. So it has this really dynamic pricing built into it. And what you're trying to do with those paintings as you get them is you're going to put them into your little tableau that you have in front of you, which will then let you trigger actions that get you more money, let you tuck down endgame scoring cards, or let you get more of those tickets that let you travel around the board more freely. So it's generally a pretty satisfying game. I do feel like it's a little bit it's a family game for sure, and I think that it might have benefited from a little bit more development, where you would be forced to not buy paintings, where you might be forced to sell paintings. If you go to an action and you can't buy a painting because you don't have the money for it, if you go to a given space, you have the option to sell it, where you'll get it at the current market rate. At the current market rate, you'll get that much money, and then those prices will go down, so it'll become the cheapest color in the cheapest region if you sell the painting. But you generally don't have to do that, except for lack of space on your player board, because you're able to get money through other means. I feel like if it almost deserves a sequel or something that's a little bit tighter and a little bit heavier, because there's a lot of great concepts in it. As a family game, I feel like it's not everything that it could be. And I rather like family games, don't get me wrong, but I feel like this design is strong enough that it could be more tense and more tight and benefit from it. So, but I do like what I've played of it so far. So that is Squire. And it looks like I've got almost everything. Let me just double check. I think I just have one more to talk about. So I'm sure that's a relief. But the last game that I wanted to talk about is Trails of Tucana. And this is not a roll and write, it's a flip and write game where you're going to have a map. And each round, you're going to draw connections along that map. So I could show you what a map looks like. Maybe if I could pull that up to the camera a little bit. And each, these hexes will have different, shapes on them. So they'll be like water, mountain, forest. And you'll flip up 2 cards, so it might say forest to mountain. And you'll draw a line from a forest to a mountain that are adjacent to one another. And over the course of the game, you're going to be connecting, far points to far points and getting points for doing that. And there are also other little artifacts that if you connect them back to a town, you'll get some recurring scoring bonuses for that. It's a 15-minute flip and write game. I had high expectations for this one just because the designers did Avenue, which was a really cool flip and write game. This one I think is a little bit simpler and a little bit less satisfying, although it's really well produced, really pretty to look at, and kind of engaging while you're playing it. But I feel like it doesn't have tough decisions in it in the way that Avenue does, because you're really at the mercy of what cards come up. So I'm perfectly fine with it, not bowled over as I expected to be with it. But so with that, I think I've kind of run through all of the Essen games I've played so far. Like I said, I do have probably another 20 or so games that I still have to play, if not more. And I'm also going to be going to BGG Con in Dallas in about 10 or 12 days. And I'll be playing games at that. So hopefully I'll be doing a sequel video on the flip side of that. And we'll be able to tell you some more about some of this year's Essen crop. In the meantime, have a good time gaming, and thanks for watching.